You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right. Every Wookiee's favorite right-hand man is here to get me through this week's urbanism and transportation news. We had a bit of a long break because of the 4th of July, which was on a Tuesday this year, which is really weird, right? Like when it happens on a Tuesday, it gets all funny. When everybody's taking the Monday off, or they take the Friday before off, or they take the days afterwards off for the rest of the week, or whatever happens. So I decided to take a couple of extra days off and didn't do as much news. So we had to schedule this back another week because we needed to collect more news to share with you all. And so that kind of makes things tricky when you try to do something every 2 weeks and the holiday intervenes. But hopefully it gets better from here. So we've got we're going to come back and do our usual 2-week schedule from here on out. Hopefully. But yeah, sorry about the couple of 3-week back-to-backs where we had a little bit of a space between. But hopefully we'll get some guests and hopefully we'll have some fun talking about the news. So I guess as I always do solo shows, we've got some previews of the upcoming Talking Headways podcasts that are coming up. I hope you enjoyed recent episodes with David Schleiser on bond funding for transportation and economic crises. That book was really fun to read and interesting too. Some really good, interesting history too about why cities in the North versus the South have better infrastructure and during the time of growth and a lot of bankruptcies and those types of things post-Civil War, I should say. And so interesting information from David on that. We also talked to Adam and Hussein about access measures, which was great too. And I hope you enjoyed this last week's episode about road pricing, which was really interesting. It wasn't a specific, example of it, but just kind of a general discussion about road pricing. So hopefully you really enjoyed that. And I really enjoyed talking with Mike about that too. So it was really, really, really interesting. Coming up, we've got Paul DePerna, who will chat about pricing carbon. And that was a really super interesting episode as well. We talk about ecosystem services and what nature is worth. She also made a visit to the Pope to convince him as well, which is I guess you have to listen to the episode to see what happened, but really positive book and hopefully looking at climate change and emissions and all of the things that we talk about on the show in the right way. Also, we've just recorded an episode on artificial intelligence and planning. So I learned a lot on that one too, and I hope you do too. Lots of interesting stuff. I know the term and the chat GTPs are going all over the place because of the interest that people have. But this episode was really interesting. And we'll talk about it actually a little bit later in this show too. And our friend Susan Crawford will be back on the show to talk about her new book in Charleston, South Carolina. Like I said on the last Mondays, her previous discussion about her book Fiber was a really popular one back in 2019 when we had her on the show. So episode 226, you want to go back and listen before she comes back on. I'm really looking forward to talking with Susan again. And we've got a lot of other, I'm looking over here at my stack of books and there's more and more coming. So we'll have books on transportation. I think I've been kind of leaning heavy on environmental books and talking with folks about cities and the environment and nature and things like that. And I love talking about that stuff. But I do think I want to focus a little bit more on our bread and butter topics of transportation going into the fall. So we're going to try to do that a little bit more. And I want to talk a little bit more about projects getting done. As you all mentioned, a couple of times I've heard from folks that really liked some previous episodes where we talked about getting projects done, making things happen. And so hopefully we'll get a few of those in as well. So stay tuned. I got some planned episodes coming up on those topics, and looking forward to sharing when we hear more and when we schedule some more things. So always looking forward to next episodes of Talking Headways. Okay. Thanks to everybody who has ordered bus and bike scarves. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to order, go to theoverheadwire.com. And if you want more than 5, we'll give you a 10% discount. Email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. I had somebody recently from the Southwest order one of our lightweight scarves, maybe to keep the sun off them because it's really hot there now. But it is the summertime, And hopefully the lightweight the lightweight bike scarf would be useful for that. But the heavyweight ones, I know that it's not winter yet, but it'll be coming, and those will be probably more popular as we get towards the Octobers and Novembers. And so, but if you want to order one of the lightweight ones, I do recommend it. It is lighter than the heavier ones for winter. The bike only scarf with some checkerboard design, it's really cool. Check it out if you get a chance. Also, we have our bookshop affiliate store, bookshop.org/shop/The Overhead Wire. All the books that we've interviewed folks talking about are in the shop. So go if you listen to one of the Talking Headways episodes and you want to find the book that we talked about on when we do have somebody who wrote a book, check it out at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/The Overhead Wire. And also, we have our Cars or Cholesterol merch at TeePublic. You can get anything, mugs, stickers, anything you want. Or if you become a Patreon member, you can also get a sticker that way at the $2 level with the Cars or Cholesterol on it, which is a really cool logo. So check that out if you get a chance. bit.ly/carsrcholesterol. And I really suggest, as always, getting the purple shirt. So this is episode 135. We're live and in session. Before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast and Talking Headways wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Sorry so much to the Stitcher listeners who will see that service disappear soon, but hopefully you'll keep following us on other channels. Seriously, that's a bummer. The Stitcher folks were really nice when they started out and we're starting to get podcasts, and they put us on their feeds and stuff, and we really appreciated that. So it's a bummer to hear that the Stitcher is disappearing, but there's a ton of other podcatchers out there, and we have, our feed goes to a lot of places, so hopefully you can find it in another spot. Also, we'll put our RSS feed in the show notes if you have a show or a podcatcher that you really, really like that might not be able to collect it without the feed URL. So bring back Reader, baby. Bring back Reader. Feeds are a big deal still to me. Anyways, thanks to everybody who subscribes through podcatchers. We really appreciate you coming back to the show. Okay, let's get to what you're here for, the news. Here are a few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. If you would like to get these stories as they come out, go to theoverheadwire.com and subscribe to the newsletter. We really, really appreciate our subscribers. That's actually the main, basically the main income for the Overhead Wire is the subscriber newsletter, and we collect basically 1,500 news items a day. We put those through the ringer and pull out the 30 to 50 interesting articles that we think the readers will enjoy on topics relating to transportation, urban planning, urban issues. And we punch them up and put them in the newsletter and make it easily digestible. We do 8 hours, so you only have to do 10 minutes of work. So, check it out if you get a chance, theoverheadwire.com. Again, you just need your email address, no credit cards or anything like that. And we're really good about not sharing your email address with anybody. I promise if you give it to us and then you unsubscribe, it's gone. I delete it really quickly. I clean lists like nobody else cleans lists. So we have a tight-knit group on there, and I think everybody is really appreciating the newsletter and all the news that we go through. So let's get to the news, shall we? Okay, cities banning drive-thrus. An estimated 200,000 restaurants around the United States have drive-thru windows that make takeaway meals and drinks easier to access by car. But some cities are exploring banning them as they undermine safety, active transportation, and good urban design that leads people to other businesses. This is by Nathaniel Meyerson at CNN. Thanks for the follow on Twitter, Nathaniel. So I think this is interesting because we've been talking about this forever, especially in the TOD space, banning drive-thrus, banning self-storage places, those types of things, because they're not really conducive to good urbanism and walkability. And one of the interesting pieces in the article that I was noticing, and a discussion that I hadn't really thought of very much, is that when you have this park once strategy of getting people to come to a main street or come to a downtown, you park once, but then you can go to a number of different stores. And so I imagine that a lot of the stores that are in kind of those zones, those areas, will appreciate the ability to drag is probably the wrong word, but to pull in customers that might not have otherwise come and seen them because people were parking and they were maybe walking down the street and they saw something in the window of a shop. So that's one thing that drive-thrus really aren't good at is kind of creating that kind of those collisions that people talk about in downtowns and cities where you can go and do multiple things at a time. There's even like a Taylor Swift video, I think, recently of her on, I think it was BBC Radio 1 or something, where she was touting the ability to go around London and New York by just hopping from place to place because it's so fluid. And whereas in LA or other places where it's more auto-centric, outside of downtown LA, of course, there's there's good connections there, or some of the neighborhoods as well. I'm not trying to hit on LA, but that's what she was saying. She just feels like her nights out get a little bit more interesting and a little bit more random because she can go to different places. So I think that kind of is the ethos of this article to a certain extent, which is talking about, the drive-throughs and the self-storage places that are being put up near transit stations and those types of things. But the idea that you can actually, park once and get to all these places and create a vibrant community. And I think it's a good idea. I mean, in the suburbs, it makes sense. You have a drive-through and you have a singular In-N-Out burger or something, and the line of cars goes forever. But in a city, you really don't want that. So anyways, I think that's really interesting. Oh, also, Bill Lindecki of Minneapolis has a great article, too, on walk-up windows, which proliferated during the pandemic and I think became really popular. So an alternative to the drive-through in very urban places. So you can have your drive-through just a walk-up window, which is really an interesting kind of flip side of the drive-through phenomenon, which became really popular during, obviously, suburbanization and during the increase of interest in automobiling. Okay, next up. AI makes the housing crisis worse. Tenant screening companies that use artificial intelligence to scour the web for information about prospective tenants are error-prone, causing some applicants to miss out on housing over inaccurate findings. 4 tenant screening companies are currently facing 90 federal civil rights and consumer lawsuits, and the results of those lawsuits are likely to set up coming battles over artificial intelligence regulation. This was by Rebecca Burns in The Lever. I think we're going to see this problem get a lot worse before it gets better. And I think that there's a lot of discussion about regulations about ways to curtail kind of some of this abuse. Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts actually has an algorithm discrimination law he's recently drawn up, and cities are working on rules and regulations for AI. And there was a recent governing article about this as well. And we actually chatted with Mike Flaxman and David Wasserman about AI last Thursday, actually. And it was super interesting discussion about what's happening in the field, and also about some of the pitfalls, some of the biases that are inherent because of how the AIs are trained. And so I think that that's something that is going to keep popping up. And I look forward to you all listening to that episode. But also I think this article by Rebecca Burns is really kind of brings up some really interesting things about tenants having issues because of these screening services that use artificial intelligence to scrape the web. And then there's all this misinformation on the web. So if you're scraping all the good information, but also all the bad information, some of that might actually tinge the results of that search. So I think that might be a problem going forward in the future. Okay, building based on past climates. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, uses precipitation records that stretch as far back as the early 19th century to predict future rainfall, and these data are used to inform infrastructure project designs. Experts explain that this means brand new projects may not be sturdy enough to withstand the impacts of climate change. While NOAA agrees that the predictions are out of date, the next update funded by the infrastructure bill won't come until 2027. That makes no sense. And we talked about this with Mike and David as well, is where, you have all these data points, but the climate's changing so much that the data points from the last 10 years are going to be way more important and should be weighted very, very heavily versus the data points from, the 19th century or the early 20th century for that matter, because the climate's changed. If you look at the temperature differences between 1900 and now, it's amazing how much the percentages have changed in terms of the climate. And you can see that, we've had the hottest days on record in that July 4th period. And maybe even since then, it just had the news popped up about it a lot. And so, we have this warming climate, and so it causes all of these really massive events. We've had flooding in Vermont. We've had massive storms in other places. You have insurance issues in Florida and in California from wildfires. And so, all these things need to be updated if we're going to build good infrastructure. And that comes to like another story that I was going to share in the bonus episodes, but it makes sense to put it here, is that climate change is impacting humans above and below ground. New research out of Chicago indicates that heat from the surface seeps underground and keeps infrastructure below buildings warmer, creating greater stress and potential for catastrophic failure. That was in Scientific American as well. So both of these articles actually in Scientific American. So there's a lot of things that extreme heat and climate change are going to do that we have no idea about. This one in particular, related to buildings and changing underground climates, is one specific thing. And we really need to deal with this. I wonder if this actually, all these heat domes that are happening right now will wake people up or not. Triple digits in the evenings in a lot of southwestern cities is not good. And I can't imagine that's very good for underground infrastructure as well. That expanding and contracting. A lot of discussion over the last 20 years or so about, in Austin, for example, about the extreme heat and the temperature differences that happen, and the pipes burst, right? The pipes under the roads because of the expansion and contraction. It's like when your house freezes and you're worried about the pipes breaking inside the house. Well, when it gets super hot, the same thing, and so there's a lot of water loss too. And so if you have these situations where you have drought, where you have you need to save as much water as possible, a lot of this is actually not good either. So. Interesting to think about what all this means to our climate strategies, and making sure that we have the right data that we can use to build infrastructure correctly. Because if it's based on things from the 19th century, from the early 20th century, that's not going to be good, because we're in a totally different era now. And on the similar note, our cities need more shade. Shade is often hard to come by, as playgrounds and bus stops generally get really hot in the summer, risking deadly consequences as heat waves become more common. Some measurements in Phoenix, Arizona show temperatures getting as high as 160 degrees Fahrenheit at bus stops in the direct sun. But fixing the issue means that cities and government agencies need to get more serious about providing shade and deal with the gauntlet of rules and regulations that make providing cool spaces difficult. This was by Rebecca Lieber in Vox. And I think this is somewhat of a response, the La Sombrita discussion, the bus stop in LA that got a lot of flack, that's kind of, they're trying to, I guess, address this. But the problem is that there's so many regulations and rules and street width issues, et cetera, about this, that it gets real complicated for agencies and governments to provide shade. And trees are, they don't just grow. Trees don't grow on trees. I was about to say that, but that's silly. But trees just don't grow, to mature trees in a couple of years. It takes a long time. And so I think you really need to think long term about what shade means and what to do about these issues with people standing at bus stops that it's really hot outside, going to playgrounds when it's really hot outside, getting the shade you need to stay cool. You see all these heat maps, in the newspapers these days because of all the heat that we're seeing in our communities. And it's crazy how, certain parts of the city are so much worse than others because of the lack of shade, the lack of green space, the lack of water, cooling efforts, those types of things. And actually, there was another article in the New York Times that I didn't put in the newsletter, but it just popped in my head, was, cities in Europe are thinking really hard about cleaning up their rivers so people can jump in during these really hot times. I think that's a really important discussion to have too. And I think they're maybe a little bit further along than we are on thinking long-term about those issues. So hopefully we can figure that out. Okay, let's go to business groups go in on bike lanes. Business improvement districts, BIDs, were formed in the 1970s to revitalize downtowns across the country and historically prioritize the needs of drivers. Now facing challenges posed by pandemic, employee schedules, and remote working options, BIDs across the country are embracing car-free streets and bike infrastructure to create more people-friendly spaces. This is by John Sirico in Bloomberg CityLab. Again, all these news articles that I mentioned on this show and the previous shows are all in the show notes. So if you want to get a link to any of these, I post them all in the show notes and on the website, theoverheadwire.com, in the blog section. These all get posted there. So if you want to click on something, or if you think something's interesting and you want to see what the full article is all about, you can go check it out in the show notes. But for this one, I think cities should be doing this more. Right? Go in on good bike infrastructure and see what happens. We really need to stop talking about 30-year timeframes to implement things, especially if climate change is coming for us now, as we mentioned in the previous several discussions, several articles. So, if BIDs want to get real serious about bike lanes and creating really big bike networks, I think you have some really good examples of bike infrastructure becoming a keystone, in Indianapolis, the Cultural Trail. I mean, that's been a really positive impact. And, the trail itself and the bike lane that, the multi-use trail that associated with it has been really positive for the city. And so using that positivity to move forward. And I know that you're going to get pushback, backlash, for some of these things, but I think it's really important to start setting these up now, because we don't have 30 years. We got to start doing things because it's getting hot. It's getting hot in here. Okay, next up, the week of the cone. A group of anti-autonomous vehicle activists in San Francisco has found a way to incapacitate driverless taxis by placing orange traffic cones on the hood, angering companies like Cruise and Waymo. Also, the activism comes right before an important hearing at the California Public Utilities Commission, where Cruise and Waymo seek to expand the scope of their autonomous vehicle trials in San Francisco. This was by Joe Kokura and SFist. So basically, this group, Safe Street Rebel, found that if you put a traffic cone on the top hood of a autonomous vehicle, it incapacitates it. And the Cruise and Waymo folks denied this, but obviously it worked, and they were so angry because it did work. It totally kind of made them blow up. And so recently you've seen all these tech advocates in San Francisco get really angry about it. Gary Tan, I guess he's one of the Y Combinator people, made a whole video about it. And there was an ad in the paper from Cruise about, pursuing safety goals and those types of things, even as at the same time as there's YouTube videos going around or TikTok videos going around of Cruise vehicles running red lights, of some of the kind of illegal behavior that they do. And, it's interesting because the companies will say that their records are stellar, but what they don't mention and what, doesn't really get talked about, even in the real world, when we talk about safety for pedestrian safety or bike safety or the close calls, those are really the things that I think people get frustrated by. Is like, yeah, you might have 2 collisions on a street, but then you had 50 close calls because it's an unsafe intersection where somebody almost hit somebody else, but just by the fact that they were paying attention, or you were on your bike and you were safer than the other person, you actually noticed that car kind of getting out of control, so you stopped before it actually happened. I think that's a really important point. And so I don't think that they're reporting that, and the data that they are reporting is limited. And they say the data doesn't support this. Well, you're not giving us all the data. So I see these vehicles in San Francisco all the time. I see the Cruise vehicles. I see the Waymo vehicles. It's never not going to be a little creepy to not see a person behind it. But I'm okay with them testing to a certain extent, but I don't want them to just flat out lie about what the data says or what doesn't say based on what they aren't telling us. So, I don't want to be your guinea pig. I don't want to be in a city where all this stuff is allowed to happen without oversight. I think that's a really important part of it. And I think that we found from the police department, from the transportation department, there's a lot of issues with these vehicles, even if the tech people don't want you to think that. And I see these cars all the time, like I said, and the technology people are getting so mad about the cones. It's actually quite funny. It's like they've never been questioned in their lives because they've just been behind a desk writing code. And here they have to, trial something in the real world, and they get pushback. And it's like their whole lives are uprooted. They get into public policy, and then they try their move fast and break things mantra, and then the break things is actually potentially dead people, and the activists are actually right, and they want to get it right. And there's going to be people who are completely anti-car, there's going to be people that are moderately anti-car, there's going to be people that just want to be safe, and a lot of those activists probably maybe run in the same circles. But you can't just point out people for being Luddites when it's actually people who want to be safe and don't want to be hit by cars, that have been terrorized by cars. They're probably pedestrians or cyclists who've been terrorized by cars, and they're tired of the close passing. They're tired of the close calls. And if you see that video of that Cruise vehicle running the red light and almost getting T-boned by one of those Trailways buses, it's not pretty, and you don't want that to happen for real and get people in serious trouble and danger. I know human drivers are bad, but these cars shouldn't be running red lights. They shouldn't be hitting people and things like that. So they need to be tested, sure, but don't lie to us about the data. And David Zipper has an article today about the AV companies touting safety. They had that advertisement in the newspaper, and are they doing this for safety? No, they're doing it for money. The safety angle is just a way to get into the good graces of the CPUC, which at the state level has control, which is why I think San Francisco is so frustrated. They don't have control over what they do, and sometimes that's fine, but the meetings have been pushed back a couple of times because I think of some of these issues that have popped up, and because of the vociferous kind of pushback at the city level to what the state's doing. So we saw the meeting pushed back a couple of times. We'll see if it actually, if they actually get approval to go 24/7. There's also other things besides the quality of life things aside from traffic safety too, that self-driving vehicles. There was an article, I think in the SF Standard or something like that, talking about how the vehicles are just at night, they're just kind of circling the same block over and over again. And so these people who are living in these houses and they might sleep at in their room might be at the front window, they continually hear the whir of the electric engine of these vehicles. And so, or the spinning sensors. And it happens over and over again because the vehicles are just circling the block waiting for a command. And so there's other things besides traffic safety that I think people are going to be frustrated by. And, people are frustrated by cars generally if it's in their face too. So lots of issues to go over. I haven't even hit a quarter of them. Oh yeah. And there's this one thing. I saw this tweet from a Navy defender online, and it just made me really mad. It said the guy said, technology wants to achieve its potential. We should get out of the way. And it's like, well, they did that with cars too in the 1900s, as Peter Norton has said a number of times. Anyways, I don't want to keep on harping on this, but it's an interesting discussion in San Francisco and frustrating at the same time. And hopefully, the cones might be making some good decisions happen. I don't know. Okay, next up. Activities centers reduce driving. Researchers at Brookings found that vehicle miles traveled could be reduced by 14,500 miles per year if people live closer to activity centers. These are neighborhoods with a relatively high number of community institutions, amenities, jobs, and tourism destinations. Looking at 110 metro areas, they found people in areas built for proximity reliably traveled shorter distances before and even after the pandemic. The benefits of these shorter trips are reduced transportation costs, increased street safety, and lowered emissions. This was by Adi Tomer and Carolyn George at Brookings. Super interesting research. I hope to have Adi on the show to talk about this more. Adi's been on the show a number of times. We love having him on. But this is interesting research. They took cell phone data stuff and started looking at how much people were traveling in cities and outside of cities, and they found that people closer to activity centers really do travel less in their car, and they have more options. And it's universal across the different metro areas too, apparently. So interesting stuff. We'll talk about this probably on a future show. And finally, in the main section, did PPP loans drive housing inflation? New research at the University of Texas shows that Paycheck Protection Program funds given to struggling businesses during the pandemic were often used fraudulently and may have contributed to home price inflation. Researchers believe that windfalls from fraudulent loans artificially bolstered real estate prices in areas where prices were decreasing or set to decrease prior to the dispersal of PPP loans. This was by Alexandra Hart in the Texas Standard. Interesting. I guess one way to stash cash that was ill-gotten because of fraud is to do it in housing. But it's also interesting how they calculated this. Many counties had a lot more like hairdressers and other service jobs than other businesses, and they were way over what a quota for that type of business would be in that county. And so I think that's really interesting that they did that and looked at maybe the possibility of some of the smaller counties having a lot of fraud. There's probably a lot of fraud in larger counties too, but they could actually tell from these places that there was some issues related to that. So, it's, something to think about during the next recession, I guess. Paging David Schleicher, thinking about that. Good job, UT researchers too. Hook 'em horns. Okay, bonus items. These are a couple of news items that I found during the last 3 weeks or so that I thought were interesting, but the readers weren't as interested in. The top articles are the ones that the readers were interested in. These are ones that got clicks, obviously, but not as many as maybe some of the previous ones. But I thought they were interesting, so hopefully you all think they're interesting as well. Maybe not, maybe so. New York State is considering higher fees for weight of vehicles that reflects their impacts on public safety. All vehicles, regardless of how they're powered, would be subject to the weight fee, and the heaviest EVs wouldn't be eligible for any tax credits. This is by Curbed. Interesting. Thinking about, basically fees for vehicles by weight. They actually impact we've talked about this a number of times recently. They're thinking about it in New York. Congestion pricing in New York has hit another milestone in the quest for federal approval. Final approval of the program was granted by the Federal Highway Administration, and the city will now start the process of figuring out the minute details of installing equipment and setting prices. It's likely charges won't start for another year, but the program approval is likely to give other cities around the country hope that they can create their own charging programs. A Belgian study took a look at links between air pollution and COVID-19 impacts. They found that those who are breathing polluted air responded to the virus as if they were aged 10 years older. This was in The Guardian. I think that's interesting. You have these respiratory issues from people who have asthma and basically dirty air days or air days with high particulates impacts that. And I think we're seeing that is the case for respiratory issues and diseases, that if you are in an area that's very polluted and you have to deal with breathing that, then it impacts you in other ways, health-wise too. A couple of weeks ago, a capstone research project from Graham Rossmore, a student at UCLA's Luskin School for Public Affairs, found that outdoor dining during the pandemic had some impressive benefits for Los Angeles. Among them were a full replacement via sales tax revenue of parking revenue, more people eating closer to where they lived, and tax revenue among many of the city's commercial corridors that doubled in 2022. I think that's a really interesting finding. It's kind of similar to that finding out of Toronto, where they found that the value of the streeteries and the outdoor seating actually was way higher than they could get from parking revenue. Without firm commitments on toll revenues, Oregon DOT is pausing 2 major highway expansions in Portland. The news is welcome to advocates who have been pushing back on highway expansion through the historically marginalized Albina neighborhood and the Rose Quarter. This is in the Portland Mercury. Toronto has elected a new mayor. Olivia Chow is likely the first mayor who is a daily bike rider. Her platform calls for greater focus on active transportation and suggested that the Gardiner Expressway be torn down. So in the Toronto Star, 78% of respondents to a new National Association of Realtors survey said they were willing to pay a little more for a house in a walkable neighborhood. There were some generational differences, however, with the younger people preferring walkable neighborhoods and the preference getting weaker in older generations. This was by the National Association of Realtors. And some numbers to show how much a little more heat impacts natural disasters. Looking at 50 years of wildfire data, researchers found that every degree hotter the temperature, over 200% more acres burn in a wildfire. That's by El País English. A couple more here that we're going through pretty quickly. I had some really good articles this last couple of weeks in the newsletter. I'm impressed. I'm really happy with these. Cincinnati recently launched a $100 million jobs bond aimed at renovating and preparing old manufacturing sites in distressed areas of the city. This move could be a model for other cities wanting to revitalize manufacturing and keeping it regionally central. The Philadelphia Citizen. And in order to revitalize downtown Seattle post-pandemic, Josh Fate of Publicola believes that reducing commercial vacancies is key, and it will need commercial property owners to accept lower rents and embrace some of the weirdness that could come along with it. This was in Publicola. He mentioned CBGB, which was a concert venue in New York City that revitalized part of the city. And letting the weird people in is actually helpful in terms of revitalizing cities. I think this is kind of maybe it's a riff off of the creative class thing that Richard Florida has touted for years, but also has been pilloried for because of the way it actually impacts gentrification, displacement. But I think at a time where we're dealing with downtowns that are empty than they were before the pandemic, I think it makes sense. I mean, these commercial property owners are not going to be able to get top value that they used to for their places. And so in order to bring more people back, they have a lot of tools at their disposal, one of which is lowering the rents and allowing different types of businesses to come in. And some of those businesses might get a little weird. I mean, that might be a good thing, though. Big announcements out of New York last week as the Gateway Project, which would build new transit tunnels under the Hudson River, got the largest ever grant from the feds at $6.9 billion. Also announced was the forward movement of the 2nd Avenue subway. New York Times and Bloomberg. The Utah Department of Transportation has chosen a gondola as its mode for adding capacity to Little Cottonwood Canyon between Salt Lake City and the Snowbird Ski Resort. The project could cost as much as $729 million and would be the longest gondola of its kind in the world. And finally, after a bitter fight, European lawmakers have passed a bill that would require the restoration of 20% of damaged habitats. Farmers were worried that it would impact food production, but proponents suggest that the new law would increase biodiversity and food production. This was in the New York Times. So a good set of news items today, a lot of things to think about. Hopefully this sparks some interest in information seeking in you all and wanting to learn more. So if you want to learn more about these, go to the articles in the show notes, or just keep checking out the newsletter, or listen to the podcast. We appreciate it. This week and every week, I do want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without you. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, and we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month, and we'll get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month, and you'll get one of our transportation scarves. You can actually, when you sign up, and you can ask for a specific scarf, and we'll send that to you right away. Also, I want to mention that we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice. If you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. And the book was fun to produce. And if you're a History of Planning fan, this was the first book listed on the American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Planning. I also want to mention that I want to thank folks, whoever out there might have done this, who nominated me for the initial 200-person list for the Plan Netizens' most influential planners list. I think they got it. They had votes and they whittled it down to 100. I wasn't on the 100 list, but I was on the 200 list. And I do think the folks who might have suggested that I be in that list of folks, I don't know if I actually deserve that. I actually believe that I don't actually deserve that, but I do appreciate it. There's so many people on that list, from the Jane Jacobs to the Lewis Mumfords to all the folks who have come before us. And, all of us who are planning today stand on the shoulders of those who came before us and those among us who are doing amazing work trying to change what's going on around the country and the world. So we have, a lot of mayors and governors and people who are changing the way we think about things. And I appreciate them. And it also makes me miss, and I mentioned this on Twitter, but it also makes me miss my friend Hank Dittmar. He's a real super influential urbanist who wasn't on the list actually, but maybe he should have been. And maybe that means I should actually get my ass in gear and get that podcast out about Hank. But anyway, thanks again for the folks who voted on that. Listener questions and comments. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to tweet at us on our social site where the podcast appears. Feel free to also email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com, and I'll try to get to them and get your answers on the show if possible. Puppies and Butterflies is the part of the show we talk about something fun, interesting, or just didn't fit in other sections. I don't know if this is fun or it's indicative of crazy housing prices, but there was a Berkeley grad student who was able to attend a year of grad school, but he commuted by airplane from LA to avoid paying for local housing. Instead of paying around $20,000 a year for housing, he ended up paying $5,600 on flights. You could probably write a whole think piece about housing costs, short flight emissions, and the benefits of seeing classmates outside of class on the weekends, but I'm willing to leave that to somebody else. And I'm wondering if we can get high-speed rail already. But seriously, it's crazy. It's crazy that this person was able to do this and actually save money. We should have cheaper housing in Berkeley and in Oakland and in San Francisco so that people can attend school and be at school for the reason they're at school, which is to, interact with their classmates. And I know that this person probably did. They probably did interact with their classmates for projects and things like that. But there's something that you said for getting that beer after class on a Thursday afternoon when you don't have a Friday class and hanging out with your colleagues at school. And I made so many great friends at grad school and undergrad for that matter, but grad school mostly, in the planning field. And, some of them are still really good friends and we chat from time to time. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate that the fact that we do know each other that well. And it was because we had class projects, but also because we were able to get a beer at some point and hang out and chat about life and all the other things that go along with that. So housing prices, can be, I guess, damaging to that to a certain extent. And this person believed that, and rightfully so, apparently, because of the money, that they could spend that money on flights. And like I said, we could talk all day about the emissions of the flight between LA and San Francisco and the reduction that could happen to high-speed rail, but it's just an indictment of our housing costs in the great state of California. So anyways, you can find me on Twitter at @TheOverheadWire or at TheOverheadWire.com. You can find me on Mastodon at TheOverheadWire, at SFB8social. I have a placeholder tweet or whatever they call it over on Threads. So if you want to follow me there, you can follow me there. I don't know if I'll start posting there or not. Maybe if Twitter goes under, I guess Elon says that he's losing money hand over fist, but that's his own fault. Thanks for joining us on Mondays at the Overhead Wire. Thanks for our generous Patreons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Honestly, you all are awesome. We really do appreciate it. We appreciate you listening to and listening to the ads because they do help us pay for editing for Talking Headways and also just to keep the lights on in terms of hosting this podcast. So thank you very much. We appreciate your time, your efforts, and keep on changing cities. And we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks.
Talking